Well, good evening and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. My name is Tom Switzer and I'm the Executive Director here at CIS. It's great to see you all this evening for a very special occasion. Thanks to the generous support from our friends at the Melbourne University Robert Menzies Institute, led by Georgina Downer, it's a great pleasure to welcome Lord Jonathan Sumption. Now, originally an Oxford history don, Jonathan Sumption has written the definitive multi-volume history of the 100 Years' War during the Middle Ages. Lord Sumption became what is widely regarded as a brilliant QC before he served as a justice on the UK Supreme Court from 2012 to 2018. A music lover, he sits on the board of English National Opera. He's also a linguist who speaks fluent French and Italian and reads Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and Latin. I'm sure I've forgotten something. In 2019, he delivered the prestigious BBC Reith Lectures, which are the British equivalent of the ABC Boyer Lectures, and they were on the relationship between politics and the law. And the subsequent book called Law in a Time of Crisis is published by Profile Books. It's a collection of essays that he's published in the past decade. Now, in a Sunday Times review of that book, Roland White remarked, quote, "You might find it difficult to tell whether Sumption is a historian who happens to be a lawyer or a lawyer with an exaggerated sense of history. What is not in doubt is the fluency of his writing. He's lively and entertaining on even the most arcane of subjects." I think it's fair to say that Lord Sumption, in short, is a true Renaissance man. And with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Lord Sumption.
I've been in Australia now for just under a week, and I've spent most of that time sounding off on quite a wide variety of subjects. It's a continuation of my habit of sounding off on quite a wide variety of subjects in the UK. And I thought that by way of very brief introduction to what's basically intended as a Q&A session this evening, I might try to explain to you how I became a sounder off. Because until 2012, when I went to the Supreme Court bench in the United Kingdom, I was a perfectly harmless lawyer. I wrote books on history and I represented clients in a variety of cases, the majority of which were rather dull. I then joined the Supreme Court, where suddenly things that I might write became a bit more important than they had been when I was simply voicing my client's case. When I retired from the court on reaching the statutory retirement age in 2018, I went on to deliver the Reith Lectures for the BBC. These were the result of a good deal of reflection provoked by the role of the Supreme Court as the nearest thing we have in the UK to a constitutional court. Given that many people think we don't have a constitution in the UK, it came as a surprise to lots of people that many of the decisions that the Supreme Court makes are actually about the Constitution. In particular, the cases arising out of the departure of the UK from the European Union gave rise to really very significant constitutional issues, the most important of those cases being the two cases brought by Gina Miller, both of which were essentially about the right of the government to sideline Parliament in its negotiations with the European Union after the referendum. I was a party to the majority judgment in the first Gina Miller case, and I'd left the court by the time that the second Gina Miller case about the illegal prorogation of Parliament was decided, but I publicly commented on it and defended the result against some fairly savage attacks from the anti-European wing of the Conservative Party. That's essentially how I became a sort of pundit. It was a largely accidental process. To some extent, I suppose, it arose out of the Reith lectures, and to some extent out of the fact that, on the whole, judges tend, even in retirement, not to comment on legal issues. And many of my former colleagues, or some of my former colleagues, certainly thought that I should have been more scrupulous in observing that convention. As a matter of fact, I think they were probably right. I don't think that I overstepped the mark by commenting on legal issues. There was a very large measure of misunderstanding about the constitutional nature of the dispute in the Gina Miller cases, and it seemed to me an important public function to enlighten the public about what this was about. In other words, it wasn't about whether we ought to be leaving the EU, which wasn't a legal issue at all. It was really about the attempt to marginalize Parliament and deal with it purely as a governmental matter, free of tiresome parliamentary scrutiny. And that is what I was talking about. But of course, it was an issue which, although I was only discussing the legal and constitutional aspects, had very powerful political ramifications. So for that reason, I asked not to be listed in any future Supreme Court cases. Although I had retired judges of the Supreme Court go onto what's called the supplemental list, which is they're not members of the court, but they're available to be called back to sit on cases if they're short-handed or need a specialist in some other area. So because I had become quite a vocal commentator on the constitutional implications of Brexit, I asked not to be listed. And then came COVID, and then I did transgress the conventions because this was not a legal issue, or only marginally a legal issue. I decided, after a considerable amount of hesitation, that the measures taken by the government on a relatively shaky legal basis involved a really quite serious governmental failure, whatever one might think about the merits of lockdowns, the absence of any serious consideration of the downside associated with lockdowns in terms of economic, societal, mental health issues, education, and so on. It wasn't so much that they'd been outweighed, they'd not even been considered. I thought this was a serious governmental failure, and I thought that the delivery of policy to professional epidemiologists who were only interested in one aspect of a very complicated issue, namely the medical aspect, without any consideration of other aspects, reflected extremely badly on our standard of government. A state of affairs partly attributable to public fear and partly attributed to some well-known defects in the personalities of the people who ran the government, ministerial level. Now, at that stage, therefore, I actually asked to be removed from the supplemental list. I'm very glad I did, because a freedom of information request subsequently resulted in the production of my correspondence with the president of the court. It was hoped that this would reveal a scandalous conflict of interest, and I was quite gratified when it was generally acknowledged that it revealed the opposite. Anyway, I do try to avoid becoming an all-purpose pundit on any subject that comes up. I try to stick to constitutional issues and to COVID, and my relations with my former colleagues are still very warm, I hasten to say. But at any rate, I suppose that explains why I'm here. And to those of you who have come, I suppose you might want to know what the hell I'm doing. Anyway, that's the best I can give you by way of explanation.
Jonathan Sumption. Well, no doubt there'll be plenty of questions to be raised about some of the issues you raised, but I'd like to start with your feature article in the Australian newspaper last weekend. You're very pessimistic about democracy, not least because of the public's lack of faith in democracy, but also the rising intolerance in democratic societies. Tell us more.
Well, I'm a natural optimist, but not on this subject, because I think that we take democracy for granted, but we tend to forget that it is an inherently unstable form of government, because it tends very easily to lead to public fear and to too much power being entrusted to demagogues who are thought to be one's salvation from this or that problem. Democracy has actually only existed in any recognizable form in Western countries, and then only for about 2 centuries. And what has sustained it during that time is not just the formal institutional framework, the fact that we have elections and so on, but a culture which enables that to work. And that culture involves a high degree of respect for opinions that we happen to disagree with. It involves a measure of restraint in the actual use of powers which have to exist for emergencies, but which can be deeply destructive if used too indiscriminately. So these are all vulnerabilities of democracy. When people start feeling that it's more important to get what they regard as the right answer than to do it in accordance with a procedure which may yield a result that you don't want.
Yeah. Is this a new phenomenon, though? I mean, there's clearly been periods in history where there's been a lot of angst about democracy.
Yes. I think that it is something that has become much more widespread. There have always been people who object to democracy. They have, on the whole, been prophets crying in the wilderness. What I think is striking about the current state of affairs as it's developed over the last half century is that it's become much more widespread, and it's become a particularly strong among the younger generation because of another problem, the vulnerability of democracy, which is that it's highly dependent on economic optimism. And it's extremely difficult to maintain faith in a system of government which has ceased to be able to deliver the continual improvement which people expect and which, with a rising population, is probably necessary.
What did Winston Churchill say? Democracy is the worst form of government,
except for every other one. Yes, well, that is probably right. But I mean, there is a strong temptation to object to democracy's failure to achieve everlasting improvements in standards of living. One has to remember that in the United States, for example, there have only been 2 short periods since its foundation when it was not getting richer, not just in absolute terms, but relative to other countries. And it's the turnaround in that state of affairs where they are still getting richer, but not in relation to other countries.
One of the key features of a vibrant liberal democracy is freedom of speech.
Yes.
Now, at the Queen's funeral in the morning, there were some protests from left-wing rebel rousers, and they had placards saying "effing imperialism," the monarchy should be abolished, and it was reported that some were arrested and one was fined about £2,000. Did the police overreact here?
Yes, I don't know that it's true that anyone was fined £2,000. I'm not saying it isn't, but I haven't heard that.
But there were certainly police.
Oh, yes. I mean, the police overreacted. I mean, as a general rule...
Why is this happening in a vibrant liberal democracy?
Well, if you give powers to the police, they will almost always exercise them 150%. I'm afraid that's the nature of the beast. I mean, we obviously need policemen, but policemen tend to take it for granted that they are empowered to run in people who are a damn nuisance. But there is no offence known to the law of being a damn nuisance. But the police are not very learned in the law. They demonstrated that during the COVID pandemic in the UK. I can't speak for the position in Australia, though we saw on television screens some rather unusual scenes, particularly in Melbourne.
Yes.
I mean, the police overreacted in that case. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't put anti-monarchist slogans onto a banner at a funeral. It's tasteless, but there's no law which says you've got to be tasteful.
That's right. And that's right. And we'll get to lockdowns in a moment. But what about Julian Assange? Now, his supporters say he represents free speech. Julian Assange, of course, is the former head of WikiLeaks, and he wants to make more transparency, the classified US information to be made public. Should the UK extradite him to the United States?
Well, I think my answer to that is no, but not for the reason that you might expect. I think the problem that Assange faces is that the UK has a very one-sided treaty with the United States, which entitles the United States, with minimal exceptions, to get extradition on demand. No such right is conferred on us vis-à-vis people in the United States that we might want extradited. And given that Assange's activities took place entirely outside the United States, the extradition request essentially depends on the right of the United States to contend that any crime which produces consequences in the United States ought to be justiciable in the United States. It's not a proposition that I am willing to accept. So, frankly, I would not extradite Julian Assange.
But this guy's an irresponsible mischief maker.
Yeah, well, that's the point I was going to go on to make. I'm not an admirer of Assange, because it seems to me that free speech is a right which is, I'm foremost in defending it. But free speech is not the same as a right to steal other people's information. Now, Assange believes that governments have no right to have secrets. I think that this is a perfectly absurd proposition. Many aspects of government, ranging from bank regulation to defence, require that governments should have secrets. Not only does Assange reject that proposition, which I think that no sensible person can really agree with him about, but he obtains the information by suborning the loyalty of a admittedly rather cranky serving officer in the United States Armed Forces. I've got absolutely no sympathy with Assange personally, but I still would not have extradited him.
And I think you've argued that attempts to make more open government leads to more secrecy, so it's counterproductive.
Yes. What I've argued is that if exchanges within government are open to the public, they will occur in a place where nobody can hear and nobody records them. And so the historical record will be distorted and in some respects destroyed.
Okay, what about this modern malign trend across the Western world called cancel culture? To what extent that is a threat to freedom of speech? You've been in the country for the last week, I think. Have you followed this controversy surrounding the Essendon Bombers football CEO and his basically being forced to resign because he's a Christian?
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Well, as I understand it, the issue on which he, or rather the religious group that he belonged to, was said to have the wrong opinions, was abortion. It's a very good example of what is wrong with that kind of reaction. Abortion is a huge moral issue. My own view is that ought to be a clinically regulated right of abortion in any civilized country. But I would certainly never suggest that you cannot legitimately hold the opposite view. It's a major moral dilemma. And it's the objection to abortion is shared by a number of religious groups, notably the Catholic Church, which is a major force. I think to suggest that somebody who adheres to the doctrines of the largest Christian denomination in the world is unfit to manage a football club is a very strange idea. It's not an eccentricity peculiar to Australia. We've had innumerable examples of that sort of thing in Europe. Some years ago, the entire European Commission was threatened by the European Parliament with being dismissed because one of their number adhered to the Catholic teaching that gay sex was sinful. Well, I don't happen to agree with that proposition, but again, it's a moral issue on which very large numbers of people, including Catholics, tend to agree with that. We had a football manager, rather closer to the Essendon case, some years ago, who adhered to a rather wacky Buddhist sect, which believed that disabilities were the result of sins committed in an earlier life when you were a different kind of animal, a proposition which was shortly afterwards endorsed by the Dalai Lama. Now, he was forced out as the chief coach of the English football team. I think that was mad for exactly the same reason.
But these things are happening a lot, it seems, across the Western world. I mean, a few years ago, there was a board member of a pretty major company in the United States who had written an article as a student in a student newspaper 35 years earlier saying that women should not serve in military, which was the conventional wisdom in those days. But when this was revealed on Twitter, there was a Twitter mob that called for his denunciation and his sacking from the board, and that's precisely what happened for an article he wrote 35 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is ridiculous, but it's more than ridiculous. It's actually quite sinister, because it seems to me that we have to, if we are going to live together as an intellectually and socially diverse society, we have got to be able to tolerate views that we profoundly disagree with, because the alternative is a degree of intolerance which is actually inconsistent with any sensible process of decision-making.
I should stress that CIS has published a lot on this subject over the last few years, but let me be the devil's advocate.
I did a podcast for you in which,
Peter
I spent an hour making this point.
Absolutely.
I promise not to take that long this evening.
No, won't. No. We'll move on soon to another subject. But on the cancel culture issue, can I be the devil's advocate? I interviewed Lionel Shriver this morning, the international bestseller writer of fiction. And since she came to the Brisbane Writers' Festival in 2016, she's basically been banned from literary festivals around the world because of this thing called cultural appropriation, which she's criticised. Yeah. Now, I put it to her that is she exaggerating the threat of cancel culture? And I said to her, and I could say this to you, you've been published, you've been reviewed widely, and your books have sold well. So isn't that proof that cancel culture does not really exist? That's what our critics would say. How would you respond?
How did she respond?
She said she conceded that point, but she said it's more deep-seated because of what's happening in the universities and the corporate world.
Well, she's actually lucky that her books are still published, and because a large number of people have been sacked, ridiculed, banned from public platforms, removed from publishers' lists for having what are supposedly the, quote, wrong, unquote, views on particular subjects. We had a notorious case in the UK last year in which the author, the editor rather, of a collection of children's poetry was said to have selected them on a basis which was implicitly hostile to racial minorities. Looking at the book, it was very hard to see why that was thought to be so, but anyway, people said that it was. And the result is that without really any examination of the book at all, the publishers simply struck it off their list, and it's been very difficult for her to get published. And this is actually a fate that serious writers, teachers in universities and so on, are encountering day after day. Most of the cases don't get publicised, but this is what is happening. I mean, legally, certainly in the UK, the courts have taken a pretty robust view about this. A woman called Maya Forstater in the UK, who worked for a think tank as a tax consultant, was forced out of her job because her fellow employees objected to her views on transgender rights, which are basically the same as J.K. Rowling's. And she sued them for constructive dismissal. The first instance judge held that, I mean, the relevant statute provides that you can't discriminate in employment against people on the basis of their beliefs. The first instance judge held there was an exception where one's belief was inconsistent with was unsuitable for, I forget what the exact phrase was unfit for dissemination in any democratic society, I think was the phrase. And the judge held that that was a correct description of her view that biological sex was a real thing. It went to the Court of Appeal, who threw out that decision with no difficulty at all, and said that it didn't matter how offensive some people found her views on this subject. They were views that were entitled to protection in any reasonable democracy. And therefore, her employer was guilty of unlawful discrimination.
Well, doesn't that give you faith in the democratic institutions?
It gives me faith in the courts, but this is a battle. But this is a battle that is being lost just about everywhere else.
What about the toppling of the statues? Now, many young people in their 20s and 30s across the Anglosphere, I don't want to say the West, but certainly the Anglosphere, are intent on tearing down statues that mark historical figures. They want to try to airbrush the past to reflect today's reality. What's wrong with them?
Well, what's wrong with them is that it involves an extremely one-sided view about human nature. Edward Colston whose statue was pulled down in Bristol.
This was at the height of the pandemic a couple of years ago.
Yes. He was a 17th century millionaire who had made a part of his fortune, probably not that large a part, out of shares that he held in the Royal Africa Company, which was at that time the principal slave trading company in England. But the reason why there was a statue erected to him in Bristol was that when he died, he left his fortune to found hospitals, almshouses, schools, and other obviously publicly beneficial institutions. Now, it seems to me clear that whatever one thinks about Colston's participation, direct participation in the slave trade, which was at that time regarded as a perfectly lawful and moral trade, but let's leave that aside, what the statue was commemorating was not Colston's activities as a slave trader, it was commemorating his activities as a benefactor of the city of Bristol, of doing things that I think everybody would agree were entirely admirable. But the mentality behind the people who pulled the statue down was that if you have engaged to whatever degree in the slave trade, nothing else about your life matters. And that's the proposition that I object to. No human being, or hardly any human being, is ever wholly good or wholly bad. We are all light and shade. And it seems to me that a state of mind which says that because you have committed what a later age regards as sinful, you simply disregard everything that you have done, which a later age might regard as admirable, that seems to me to be an extraordinary piece of fanaticism. Now, the four people principally responsible for pulling the statue down were subsequently prosecuted. And at their trial, their defense was that their human rights entitled them to pull the statue down because they had a genuine belief that the existence of a statue in the heart of Bristol commemorating somebody who had been engaged in the slave trade was an iniquity, and that they were entitled to destroy it. The judge gave a very muddled summing up, which basically said, well, if that was a genuine belief, that was a good defense. So the jury acquitted them. Earlier this week, the Court of Appeal ruled that he should not have given that direction, and that the genuineness of one's belief was never an excuse for destroying public property, a proposition which I regarded as self-evident before the verdict, and indeed afterwards as well. But when I wrote an article in the newspaper saying that I thought that this was an extraordinary travesty, a great cohort of well-meaning but rather muddled opinion descended on me with objections. Some of them said the judge's direction was manifestly right, which we now know was not true. Some of them said it ought to be right whether it is in law or not. The law on the whole is on the side of the angels on this. But you know, the law is only one aspect of this.
But the more sophisticated critique, that is the sophisticated defenders of tearing down statues, if I could put it like that, like The Guardian, for example, they would say the people
That's
who pull
the first
down...
time I've heard The Guardian described as sophisticated.
Well, as I said, sophisticates, not sophisticated, sophisticates.
Okay, all right.
No, you're quite right. But they'd say that those people wanting to pull down the statues, they're not trying to change the past. They simply want to change how we commemorate it in the present.
Yes, that's the David Runciman
Absolutely.
defence. And the reason why I object to it is the one that I've already given. I'm prepared to accept that one would not wish to commemorate slave trading in a statue now. Let us suppose that a statue had been erected to somebody who did nothing else with his life but trade in slaves, and there was an inscription under it which said, J. Smith, hero of the slave trade.
Yes.
Okay?
Right. Yes.
Now, that would be a ridiculous thing to do.
Right. Yes.
Whether you would be entitled, I don't not suggesting you'd be entitled to pull it down, but one would be perfectly entitled to object to a statue for exactly the same reason that one might object to putting up a statue of Hitler.
Yeah.
But that's not the position. The position is, here is a man who did something which by modern standards is bad, and a lot of things which by modern standards are good. And it's the one-sidedness, the falsification of the past by taking only one aspect of a man's personality and treating it as the whole that I object to.
What about the public apologies for historical events? This is Daniel Finkelstein. I'm not agreeing with the premise of the question. I'm just testing our guests in a classic liberal tradition. Daniel Finkelstein from the London Times, a conservative, he says in response to you, the point of an apology is to convey our understanding what was done was an error, partly committed as a result of prejudices we are still working to eliminate.
Well, if you take the context of slavery, which was, I think, the context in which he was criticising me, that seems to me to be absolute nonsense for this reason. I have never met somebody today who thinks that slavery was a good thing. This is an intellectual battle which is no longer taking place because it's been won. It's been won more comprehensively, more completely than any other debate I can think of. There is nobody who is not an obvious nutter who would defend the slave trade today.
Yes.
Frankly, I think that we don't need to pull statues down in order to advance that debate. The debate is over.
Yeah. What about lockdowns? You were the leading critic of the British government's draconian measures during the lockdowns throughout 2020
Well, I hope I
and
was.
2021. Well, you were widely regarded as. What about the counterfactual? You mentioned David Runciman from The Guardian. He had another go saying, quote, if the government had not locked down and if many more people had died, the pressure on government to act would have grown, and the threat to the things that Sumption values, freedom of choice, personal assessment of risk, would have been even greater.
Well, I don't accept that for this reason. First of all, I think that the whole debate on the epidemiological side was based on a false comparison. It was based on a comparison between what would happen if if nobody took any measures to protect themselves, and what would happen with a lockdown. The idea that human instinct for self-preservation was going to be in some way suspended during the pandemic, so that the counterfactual that you should assume is that nobody does anything to protect them, was ridiculous. And the test for this is Sweden. My view is that what should have happened is that the government should have made use of one of the most helpful aspects of the pandemic, which is that it affected primarily known categories of vulnerable people. Everybody was equally vulnerable to getting the disease, but with very small number of exceptions. The only people vulnerable to either becoming seriously ill or dying were the old and people suffering from a finite list of identifiable clinical conditions, mostly affecting the respiratory system. And my view was that we should have persuaded such people voluntarily to take measures for their own protection, which would have enabled the great majority who were in good health and were not and were in the prime of life to continue to live normal lives, instead of which we adopted, in response to a highly discriminating pathogen, a wholly indiscriminate policy. Now, the test of that is Sweden, because that's exactly what the Swedes did. And it's what we set out to do, because the pandemic plan that we, in common with most European countries in the UK, had prepared in advance for just this situation, envisaged that we would not use coercion and that we would concentrate our efforts on dealing with the problem of the most vulnerable categories, something which was easier to do with COVID-19 than with any other recent epidemic pathogen.
Yeah, but the public opinion seemed set on putting public safety first.
Well, my view puts public safety first as well. I think that it is quite possible that a small increase in the death rate or the hospitalization rate would have resulted from my proposal to have a voluntary system by comparison with what we actually did. But a small reduction in the death toll, is that worth the long-term and catastrophic damage that we have done to a generation of school children, that we have done to those vulnerable to mental illnesses such as dementia, in the UK, much the biggest killer of people? Is it worth the extraordinary economic damage, the wrecking of the public finances, the accumulation of debt for the future generations? My view is no, you would need quite a large death toll to outweigh that. But we can look at Sweden, which did adopt a voluntary policy. We do not, of course, know what would have happened in Sweden if they had had a lockdown. But what we do know is that the results of a voluntary policy in Sweden were, in death toll terms, hugely more favourable than those in the UK. And Sweden is a broadly comparable country. It's sometimes said, well, the density of population in Sweden is much lower. That's only true if you count in the frozen wastes of the north where nobody lives. 85% of the population of Sweden lives in Stockholm. Density of population is higher than it is in London.
There's a real intolerance about this debate at the height of the pandemic. As you know, I host a radio national program on our public broadcaster. And in around April, May of 2020, I put to my producer, whom I won't name, that we should do a recording, a segment on the Swedish example. And she went to great lengths to make sure we didn't cover it because it would be inappropriate.
The BBC took a pretty similar line.
Yeah, no, it's all very depressing. We will take questions very soon, but I have to ask you about Brexit. You've been a Remainer, as you've made clear in your introductory remarks. So in 2016, you voted for Britain to stay in the European Union. Yet these are the views of the Spectator editorial, and you've contributed to the Spectator like I have. It's widely believed, especially among conservatives, but also a lot of working class, Labor voters in the Northern England and the Midlands, so this goes beyond left and right. It's widely believed, this is the Spectator, that there's a lot wrong with the EU. It's bloated, protectionist, elitist, posturing, and it strongly supports state intervention in economic and social affairs. So why do you support Britain staying in the EU?
The problem about this whole issue is that both sides of the argument seem completely incapable of weighing up pluses and minuses. Most issues of public policy are not clear-cut. It's a question of weighing the pros and cons. People say the EU is a defective institution, and I agree that it's a defective institution for all the reasons that the Spectator editorial said.
And yet?
But I still think we should join because the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, great as the latter are. I think that it was, first of all, I do not buy the patronizing explanations that it is comforting for many Europeans and many pro-Europeans in Britain to utter about why this happened. I don't accept that this was a piece of post-imperial nostalgia. I don't accept that it was because the UK public were gullible. They were lied to, but nobody believed the lies.
Yes.
I don't accept that it was a piece of an indirect way of objecting to globalization. I think it was quite simply what it professed to be. The slogan, "Take back control," persuaded a lot of people. And my reason for disagreeing with them is essentially that you don't take back control by leaving an institution which is going to dominate you even if you're not a member of it, because it's a $500 million market right next to us across the channel. It's going to overshadow us economically anyway, so we might as well have at least the degree of control that we had before leaving by participating in its decision-making process. And we were one of the most influential members of the EU. We've lost that now.
Yes.
So we've lost control, essentially.
Okay, well, following on from your argument about Brexit, you have also said that the future belongs to internationalism, not because of what it stands for, but simply because of what we all face. Let's take an example like climate change. Now, there have been 30...
But that's the context in which I said that.
Okay, but there have been 30 global conferences on climate change, or 30 UN COPs, as they're called, in the last 30 years. There's never been a legally binding, verifiable, enforceable, genuinely global agreement to reduce emissions, so much so that you have China and India and the non-OECD, their emissions are steadily escalating despite what they sign at these international agreements.
Yes, well, the Paris Agreement was the nearest we ever got to it, and I agree that that wasn't near enough. I think the big problem about this, and it's one of the reasons why I'm frankly not very optimistic about the future of democracy, is that it's a problem that can only be tackled at international level, and lines of accountability are necessarily national, so that the solution will be one which will escape the ordinary processes of democratic scrutiny. And I think that for exactly the reasons you give, the problems that countries like China, Malaya, and Brazil have with the idea of tightening their belts in order to help out a problem when the West has basically had the benefits of polluting the world, and they're still hoping to get those benefits themselves.
Right.
All of that is true. But sooner or later, we will arrive at a situation where the catastrophe is so close that people will change their view about that. This is, I think, beginning to happen anyway.
When you say a catastrophe, what do you mean?
Well, I think that, a catastrophe to the survival of the human race. I accept the scientific case to the effect that sooner or later, unless something is done, that is what will happen. I don't accept the stuff about tipping points. It seems to me that it's much more likely that the closer we get to the catastrophe, the more disruptive and the more expensive will be the process of getting out of it. And that's a very serious problem. But this is inescapable. But it's like saying to yourself, well, since we're at a table in a restaurant and we're going to divide the bill by 10 at the end of the day, we might as well order lobster. The fact is, if no one else is going to apply the same disciplines, there's no incentive to do so yourself. That is sooner or later going to change, but it's going to change, I think, at a stage when the answer will be very disruptive indeed. I shall be dead by then, but I fear for my children.
Yep. First question from James Phillips, who's a CIS board member. James, there's a microphone. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much for this discussion. An adjunct scholar of the CIS wrote a book published in 2018 on the new authoritarianism, Salvatore Barbones.
Who's here tonight? Yep.
Good, excellent, Salvatore. And it was basically about the authoritarian leanings of new classes of experts that seek to and often succeed in dominating or controlling areas of our lives. And perhaps in one of the things that we saw in the response to the pandemic was some sort of reverence for experts, albeit experts in only one aspect of the crisis, and an acceptance that that strident dictates from an expert group were almost by definition legitimate, and we should submit. Do you have any views on whether there is a cultural propensity in societies like ours towards expert authoritarianism, and any views on how it might be constrained?
The problem is not due to the experts. The problem is due to the politicians who are prepared to follow the experts to the exclusion of all other relevant factors. Why does that happen? The answer, I think, is that the politicians who make these decisions, saying we are following the science, the endless mantra of the British government, and I think many governments, is essentially a way of evading responsibility for a decision that actually involves weighing the scientific considerations against the other considerations, the societal ones that I've been talking about. It's a way of evading responsibility. It's a way of avoiding the unavoidable fact that a decision which involves weighing up pluses and minuses across the whole spectrum of relevant factors is necessarily a political decision and not a scientific one. In their evidence in the UK to the relevant parliamentary committee, the chief scientific officer and the chief medical officer said, oh, well, we quite accept that there are serious collateral consequences of locking people down, and we quite accept that they ought to be taken into account, but it's not our job to do that. The real problem is not in their approach, which is obviously justifiable. The real problem is that it was no one else's job either, and that is down to the politicians. Why are they like that? They are essentially like that because deaths from a pathogen like COVID-19 are they appear nightly on one screen, they are dramatized, whereas the collateral consequences are less dramatic, less direct, less obvious. So if you're a politician and you ask yourself one question only, which is what they did do, and the only question you ask yourself is, what am I going to be criticized for? The answer is, you're going to be criticized for the immediate, for the dramatic, and for the pictorial. You're not going to be criticized for the hundreds of thousands who die of dementia earlier because they were locked away from any kind of mental stimulus. People like my sister-in-law who suffered exactly that fate as a direct result of the lockdown. But there are hundreds of thousands of people in her position. And that's never going to feature on a politician's agenda, not sufficiently directly related to lead to their being criticised.
Next question.
Lord Sumption, when I grew up, I learned about, I think, human rights, like many perhaps, through the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution, and I subsequently learnt about the earlier Bill of Rights in England and read Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet on the rights of man. So I'd always understood that human rights were really about the protection of the individual and the citizen against the power of the state. More recently, it has seen that there's been a troubling reverse where human rights seem to be invoked to defend or to use the power of the state against the individual. And then we've seen this really, I think, in dramatic form in COVID. I'd be interested in your views on that.
Well, I'm not aware that human rights were a significant factor in the decision to lock people down. Maybe that was the position in Australia. I have heard an argument to say that the right to life overrides all other factors, and therefore obliged states to take any measures whatever that might reduce the loss of life. But I don't think that there is any respectable argument to the effect that that is required by any human rights instrument of which I'm aware. All human rights obligations are necessarily qualified by other factors that may legitimize a different decision. That's certainly been the position under the European Convention, and I believe the United Nations Convention as well.
Next question.
Yes, no, a question I had particularly regarding your reflections on the mixture of light and shade that we see in individuals, and people's difficulty in grasping the idea of people being both good and bad, seems also to apply to our states and our countries. Particularly in this country, we have a bountiful and plentiful prosperity, which a lot of us enjoy, but also historic trauma inflicted partly due to colonization and partly due to other factors over time. And it seems to me that people struggle to reconcile with the idea that a state can be both good and bad and to trundle along with it. It seems to me that a lot of people would rather discard entirely the legitimacy of the state on the grounds of some previous sin as being incapable of remedy in the present day. And I wonder if I could get your reflections on that.
Well, I mean, my reflections are very much the same as yours. I think that, I mean, you're in a sense comparing oranges and Thursdays because you're looking on the one hand at the wrong committed against the indigenous population, notably by the early colonists, which was essentially genocidal. And the prosperity, which was only partly the result of human endeavor, which basically arises from the considerable richness of the Australian continent in natural resources. I would suggest to you, but I mean, I agree with the basic point that you're making. Another example, which may be a better one because it involves human activity on both sides, is that Britain was both the largest single slave trading nation in the 18th century and the principal agent of the suppression of the slave trade in the 19th century. We were the first country to ban the slave trade and then the first country to ban slavery itself. I find it intensely irritating finding my country criticized for its participation in the slave trade by citizens of a country, namely the United States, which abolished slavery 40 years later and needed a civil war and the death of 600,000 people in order to do it. So there is an example of a country which did things that, in our view and by our own moral standards, were profoundly wicked, and also did more to remedy the situation in the following century than any other country. Light and shade.
Next question, Janet Albrechtson from The Australian.
Oh, thank you. Lord Sumption, can I just tease out some of the points in your article on the weekend when you talked about the demise of democracy, economic insecurity, fear, COVID, and cancel culture, our inability to disagree well. Perhaps we're discovering that human beings don't want to disagree well. Perhaps we're discovering that, and this goes to James's point about the authoritarian experts, and you say they're not the problem and the politicians are the problem, but perhaps we are the problem. Perhaps it's people that are quite happy to cave in to a set of unreasonable rules, laws, regulations. We had more of them than any other country in Australia for a long, long time. We were locked inside our country for a long, long time. And perhaps we're discovering that when people can't own a home, when our education system is going backwards, when the health system is not coping, that we would quite like to have someone who can get things done.
Yes.
Are we meant to be democratic? Is this an aberration?
Well, that is basically the principal factor behind the demise of democracy in those numerous cases where democracy has failed. I mean, I entirely agree with your analysis. The problem is that you only discover too late that autocracies are no better at resolving these problems than democracies. In fact, experience suggests that they're considerably worse, because the point about autocracy is that by suppressing dissent, it leads to ill-considered decisions. It leads to, because there's no contradictory view that you have to consider before making a decision, it leads to the flattery of those in power, to sycophancy and subservience, and to a degree of carelessness in the exercise of public powers, because there is no genuine criticism, which greatly aggravates the autocratic tendencies which are inherent in government anyway.
Jonathan, Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, she said that if the Supreme Court ruled that a second independence referendum, and of course the first one in 2014 failed, if the Supreme Court block it, then she would turn the next general election, that would be due by January 2025, she'd turn that election into a de facto referendum on Scotland leaving the UK. What's your sense of how things will play out in Scotland?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite likely that the Supreme Court will say that she can't have her referendum without Westminster's consent, because that is what the Act, the Scotland Act, says in black and white. And, you know, that this was a deliberate decision when Scotland was given a large degree of autonomy. That the constitutional future of the relationship between the UK and Scotland was expressly reserved as a matter within the exclusive jurisdiction of Westminster. So, you know, unless something very surprising happens, it is going to be blocked. The legal powers are all in the hands of Westminster, and UDI is not an option, because a heavily indebted Scotland, which is what it would be, would find it impossible to raise money on the international money markets if it was not a legally recognised government. So, you know, I think that's the reality. As to what will happen if she seeks to make the general election a referendum on Scotland and on its independence, I think the problem is that it's not within the power of Nicola Sturgeon to decide what it's going to be a referendum on. It's within the power of the voters. If the voters are not prepared to treat it as a referendum on independence, well, that's the end of that. It is what she really means, I think, is that if she wins a majority of Scottish seats, she will be able to claim that it shows that a majority want independence. Well, first of all, past experience suggests that there are a large number of people who vote for the SNP who do not believe in independence. After all, they have 58 of the 60 parliamentary seats, but couldn't muster more than 45% in the referendum. Secondly, it doesn't alter the basic position, which is that the SNP wants independence and the UK is saying no. And that is going to be just as likely to be the situation afterwards. No party, national party at Westminster, none of the three major national parties, finds it in their interest to concede Scottish independence. The Labour Party would find it very difficult to form a majority government ever again without Scottish seats. The Conservative Party, although it would benefit from the departure of Scotland, is adamantly against the secession of Scotland on principle. The Lib Dems the same. So in my view, it's not going to happen unless the Labour Party reaches a Faustian pact to let them have their referendum in return for support. Well, it would only last for half a parliament, because if Scotland then seceded, that would be the end of any possibility of Labour deriving votes for Scotland. So I don't think that's going to happen.
No. Speaking of Sturgeon, she said overnight that it's taken, quote, just 3 weeks for the Tories to realise that Liz Truss was a disaster. Your thoughts on Liz Truss after 3 weeks in the job?
Well, Liz Truss has made a bad start, quite plainly. And her basic problem is that she's been elected leader of the parliamentary party, but the parliamentary party didn't want her. They didn't vote for her. She's been foisted on the parliamentary party by the membership at large. And the membership at large is interested in replicating their own views in the leadership of the party. The MPs, who in my view should have had the right of decision, have a much broader interest in winning elections, which involves bidding for the support of an altogether wider demographic than any local constituency party will ever be interested in. So I think this was a classic mistake.
Yeah, but David Cameron was voted by the grassroots and he won an election.
Yes.
So too was Theresa May and Boris Johnson. He won a landslide.
Well, no leader of any party who was elected against the preferences of his own MPs or her own MPs has ever won an election in the UK.
Oh, that's interesting.
David Cameron was elected, but with the support of the MPs. He won both before the MPs and in the constituency associations. Okay. But Ian Duncan Smith was foisted on the party by the membership in 2001. He lasted just 2 years before they booted him out.
Didn't even contest an election.
He didn't even contest an election. Ed Miliband also voted against the objections of most of his MPs. Jeremy Corbyn voted as leader against the strong objections of 9/10 of his MP. They were all complete disasters.
Yes. We'll wrap it up very soon, but I have to ask about your Liz Truss's immediate predecessor, Boris Johnson. And you have written, you once compared Boris Johnson to Benjamin Disraeli, whom you described as, quote, an outsider, an ambitious adventurer, and an unscrupulous opportunist, totally amoral, and, as it turned out, an excellent Prime Minister.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say that about Boris Johnson, though, would you?
No, I wouldn't. The fact is you can be all of those things and a good Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was all of those things and a rotten Prime Minister.
Well, it's great. Yes. One more question before we leave, and I'm sorry I can't see you there. Yes. Last question. Yes, Bruce.
We have a law in this country that if you want to come in, you have to be vaccinated against COVID-19. We had a famous tennis player who wanted to come in, said, I don't want to be vaccinated.
Djokovic.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So he kicked him out.
He couldn't play in the Australian Open.
Do you think that we were justified in doing that?
Well, as I understand it, he had been given assurances by overseas representatives of the Australian government that he could come in. For that reason, I think that it was outrageous to kick him out. But as a general rule, I'm not in favour of compulsory vaccination. But I don't see why you shouldn't make entry into a country dependent on a vaccination status. There are plenty of other diseases like yellow fever, for which many countries will exclude people who have not got vaccination certificates. This is a choice for the individual who wants to go somewhere. If you want to go to Australia, it seems to me you have to comply with Australian rules, whether they're good rules or bad ones. And I don't think those are particularly bad ones.
National sovereignty, eh?
Certainly, among other things.
Yep. Wasn't that what Brexit was about? We won't start.
Sure. But how much national sovereignty have we gained? Precious little.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.